Welcome everyone. This is the start of a series to take you through the process of developing an Angular website with .NET backends. In this first video, we're going to focus on just creating a starting website, configuring our project to run in VS Code, and by the end of the video, you should be able to browse a working Angular website, get data from a .NET API, and have debugging with breakpoints available in both the Angular code and the .NET code. So let's talk about prerequisites. All of the prerequisites we're going to use are completely free, don't require registering any accounts on websites or anything else like that. And we're going to start off with Visual Studio Code. This is the IDE we're going to be writing all of our code and doing our debugging from. You could do the same things with other IDEs like Visual Studio or JetBrains Writer. Just note that if you follow this series with another IDE, some of the topics we cover, they won't apply to you or they may be slightly different. And that's especially true in this first video where we're setting up our environment. Next thing you're going to need is the .NET SDK. As of the time I'm recording this, the latest is .NET 6.0.4. But I'm going to assume you should be able to use the latest version in most cases. So if you're missing either of these, just go ahead and Google them, download them, and come back to the video when you're done. Okay, hopefully you're all set. Now, you can see I've got a folder here set up where I'm going to be putting all of my code. Anything you decide should work, just keep in mind that the paths that I type won't be the same as the ones you need to type. So once you've got that set, just go ahead and open up a terminal program. You can see I'm just using the Windows command prompt, but any of them should pretty much work. And if you're not familiar with commands and command lines, don't worry too much. We're just going to enter a couple of commands here. Just follow exactly what I type if you're unsure, and we'll be out of here in no time. So the first thing we need to do is create a solution. So we'll do .NET new solution and -o so we can follow it by the name. And in this case, I'm going to do tutorial Angular. You can pick anything you want there. And then we're going to go ahead and browse into that folder that we just made in the command prompt. And once you've switched folders, now we need to go ahead and create the projects that we're going to add to the solution. So .NET new Angular, that's the type of project we're creating. And -o again for the name, and we will do, let's just do website to keep it simple. And we'll do one more project. It's not really super important for now, but it is really important in the end, especially if you're going to be making, business grade websites. So we'll do a new XUnit project, and I'm just going to call it website.test. And if we flip back over to Explorer, you should see now that, we've got our solution file that we made and two folders that both have some different code in them already. And we're definitely going to jump into that soon, but right now our solution doesn't know about those projects that we placed in there, so we need to go ahead and reference those. The .NET new, .NET solution, add, and then just the name of the projects that you had chosen above. So website and website.tests were the ones that I had used. All right, if you've done that correctly, you should see that they were added to the solution. And now I'll be using source control for everything that I do, and I recommend you do as well. So let's go ahead and set up that. So we'll have get init, and then we'll go ahead and do our login information or our commit information. So get config. You don't need to do this if you've already set up global username and email, but I work on a lot of different projects for a lot of different companies, and I just like to be safe and never set my globals. So git commit user .name, and then just the name. I'll pick tutorial topic tutorials. And then we're going to do an email, tutorials@smallbang.com. All right, now we should be able to commit to different repositories or remote locations if we need to. If you've done that correctly, I think we're ready to go ahead and launch VS Code. So just type code, space, and a period with enter. The next thing I want to just show you is the extensions that I have in VS Code. So I have a .NET Core Test Explorer. This is just going to show me the list of all the unit tests that I set up for the backend. We have the Angular language service. This is extremely highly recommended. This is going to give you all the IntelliSense between your Angular views, the HTML and the TypeScript and that sort of thing. So definitely grab that. C#, you're going to need that for sure for building this project. I have another one called coverage gutters. This tells me the coverage in the files that I open and if they've been covered in the unit testing or not. I have IntelliCode. That's just some more IntelliSense for specifically TypeScript. We have npm IntelliSense. That's going to give us some more IntelliSense for bringing modules into our code, just importing references with simple clicks. I have Peacock. This lets me change the colors of my Visual Studio projects. Since I work with so many, sometimes having different colors, if you see the bar that's blue at the bottom, I change that color depending on the project that I'm in, just so I can kind of know where I'm at a glance real quick while I'm tapping around. I also use the Prettier Code Formatter. This is just going to give us some options to format our HTML and our TypeScript and some of the other things with a different formatter than the applied one or the one that's included with VS Code. You don't have to grab this. You don't have to grab the Peacock one that I just mentioned above. These are very optional. Rainbow brackets, that's another optional one. This just gives me different color brackets depending on the level of nesting of the code that I'm working with. Again, it doesn't hurt to have it. It's just going to show you what I see on my screen as well. Visual Studio Key Map. If you're not already a Visual Studio user, I wouldn't grab this one. Just stick with learning the VS Code hotkeys. I went ahead and grabbed this one just because I'm a heavy Visual Studio user. VS Code Grade Icons. This is just going to modify some of the icons that show up in our project listing. Just give you at a glance what they are. And back to the extensions. XML tools, another very optional one. This one I really just use for the XML formatting, but definitely not necessary. And that's it for the extensions. There's a ton more extensions in here that are available. You definitely, just browse the list in your free time and see which ones you like and you prefer. Okay, hopefully you've got your extension set up. Just one more time down the list. And the next thing we should really do is just run the website. Let's make sure that it works. And if so, then we'll go ahead and check it into our source control. So I'm going to hit F5, but if you don't like hotkeys, you can click on Run and Debug over here. And you'll see the .NET Core Launch Web task. And this was added when it asked us, did we want to add the required assets to build? So just go ahead and click on the play button. And the first thing it's going to do is download all of the dependencies that are needed to run the Angular website. So you can see it's restoring dependencies using npm. And this may take a couple of minutes depending on your internet speed, your computer, and how many of these you've downloaded with other projects before. I'm just going to go ahead and let it run so you guys can see how long it takes. Obviously, I've downloaded most of these before, so it's a little quicker for me. And once it starts to run successfully, you should start to see a terminal window pop up as well as a web browser. So you can see my web browser here. Let me show you the command prompt. There we go. And we're just going to continue waiting on this command prompt that popped up, and hopefully it says compiled successfully as mine does. And then you're looking at a website that says hello world, and it has a couple of different options up on the menu. Counter, fetch data. These are just some set up pages that were with the sample. So everything looks good, everything's running. You can go ahead and close down your browser as well as that terminal window that opened. So I'm going to close the terminal window, and I'm just going to hit stop debugging or shift F5, whichever you're more comfortable with. So stop. Now you can hit stop and it should close that terminal window on its own. Sometimes I close it manually, sometimes I let the debugger close it. It's kind of random for me. So everything was perfect. Now if we look over here on this tab that says source control, you can see there's 166 files pending to be checked in. That's all, all the files that we created minus a couple that it already excluded. So there's a couple here that I don't want to check into source control. And these are ones that Angular is built with some caching files, and you're just not going to want to start including those into your source control in the first place. If we look further down the list, there's some DLL files that are here and that were all brought or brought into the binaries folder. And let's go ahead and exclude those as well. So in order to exclude files from your Git, you're going to need a git ignore file. And if you look, we have one up here in this website folder. Now, it's not being used at the moment because we initialized our Git all the way out at the solution. That way it includes all of the projects that we have. So what we're going to do is just grab this git ignore file, drag it down below our solution file, and you should get a prompt asking you, are you sure you want to move it? Just go ahead and click move. And now you can see it's out here with my tutorial solution file. Now if we look up, we have now 59 files pending, but we still have this Angular cache one here. So this wasn't part of the initial ignore template that came with the project. So let's open it up and fix that. You can just pick anywhere in the file. The order of these don't matter. I tend to do my specific ones at the top. And we're just going to use the folder name. You don't have to do a whole path here. This is just relative. So I'm just going to do .angular with a slash at the end. And the reason we picked .angular was because when we browsed over here, that was the path that it showed us for these files. So just one more look down the list, looking for anything crazy that we don't want to check in. And it all looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and type a commit message, and we'll just say initial commit fresh install. And if you're good with that, you just want to hit this little check mark here that says commit. And now it's committed to your local repository. If you're planning on using GitHub or another service out there, for GitHub, you can just click Publish Branch, and it has some integration built in that will go ahead and link it up, make you log in to authenticate, and set you up. If you're planning on using another service or maybe a private repository that your company uses, you can just come over here to your terminal. I'm just going to hit enter so it gives me a fresh terminal. And all you need to do to point it is just git remote add and the URL. So we'll just say, HTTPS your git URL here, and you just go ahead and hit enter on that. Now I don't plan on doing that here. I'll link mine up to a private repository later off the video. So just know that you need to do that if you want to use a private repository or a different service than GitHub. And then you're all checked in. Okay, so hopefully everything's working for you and you're caught up. Now let's kind of focus on some VS Code specific things real quick to make sure that your setup is going to kind of match mine a little bit. If we go to preferences, file preferences, settings, and we type in format up here. You can see that I've got format on paste checked and format on save. And these are just preferences, so whenever I save my files, they apply a little formatting, make sure that my indentation is right, or there's not some extra spaces that could be cleaned up, that kind of stuff. And the next thing is the F1 key. The F1 key is pretty big in VS Code. It gives you actions for pretty much anything that VS Code can do. In this case, I mentioned in the plugins that I use Peacock to change the colors of my VS Code windows depending on whatever project I'm using. So let's just do that now and kind of demonstrate. I'm just hitting the enter key. You can select things with the mouse as well. And I'm gonna go ahead and, for this project, let's pick React Blue. I like that baby blue. And then again, so just hitting the F1 key, typing anything that you can't remember how to do. If it's available, it'll pretty much show up in here. And if we just look down the list, you can remove all breakpoints. These are just some of my recently used ones. Run all tests, save without formatting. There is a whole list of things that are available to do in here depending on the extensions that you have and stuff like that. Let's say we wanted to commit our code. Well, we could do git commit. It's going to ask us for our message. We type in any sort of a pending message and hit enter. The next thing we need to get set up is to enable debugging for both the Angular/TypeScript code and the .NET code. And the way this is initially set up is to just enable us to debug the .NET side of things, but we also want to be able to set breakpoints inside of our TypeScript and have that, actually hit while the browser is running. So to do that, we need to go up here to the VS Code folder, and we need to open the launch.json. You can see here the name of this configuration is .NET Core Launch, and that matches to what we had seen earlier in the drop-down list for the run and debug section. So you can leave that name as it is, it's perfectly fine. And if we scroll down, I don't want to explain everything in here, but you can see there's a pre-launch task of build, which is going to build the .NET project. You can see here for the program that it's going to try to attach that debugger to. It's going to try to connect to the website DLL that it made. This path won't exactly match yours unless you typed website for the name of your project as well. Just note that everything should be fine since the project was running. Now, enabling client-side code, you're going to need to add a new configuration. So just pay close attention to where I'm typing, everything, and make sure that you don't make too many mistakes in here, because this really will stop your debugger from doing anything when you hit F5 if you've got some mistakes in here. So the test that we're going to create, we just need to come up with a name. We'll just call it browser debugger. Next thing is we need to know the requests. And the request is pretty much, is it going to attach to a browser window or is it going to launch one? And in this scenario, to get this all working right, we want to select launch. Now the type that it's going to launch here, if we go back, you can see that I've got options for Chrome, I've got MS Edge. If you've got some different extensions installed, you may see some different ones. So I'll just go ahead and select Chrome. MS Edge should work perfectly fine, just whatever you prefer. Now when it launches, it needs to know where is it going to try to go. So for the URL, this is not going to be a copy and paste what you see me typing in here. Whenever this project was generated, when we were at the command line earlier, it assigned a random port number to the project, and that's just to avoid conflicts with other projects. If you have multiple projects going, they can't both be using the same port. So let's find our port. So let's go to the Explorer, and if we come down and we find the properties, launch settings.json, and if we look in here under profiles, we'll see the website and then the command name project here. This middle section is the one that we want to grab from. So you can see for application URL, it's got two set up in here, and that's because it's going to support HTTP and HTTPS. There's no reason, unless you're having problems, to pick the HTTP one. So we're going to just copy out the URL for the HTTPS, and we're going to come over here and we're going to paste it in. The next thing that this debugger needs to know about is where are the client-side files that it needs to know about. So you can see web root is an option, and it's went ahead and filled out the web space folder. That's perfectly fine, but we need to go a little deeper than that. So we're going to do the name of your project, and the client app folder inside of that. So again, just pay close attention. Your names might not match mine, but in the end, you'll have this new one show up over here in the dropdown. You can see that now we've got browser debugger, which is the one we just made. The problem is we can't actually start two of these at the same time, or if we could, we'd have to go select one, then select the other, and that's just not a nice, smooth development experience. So what we want to do is tell VS Code to launch two of these at the same time anytime we start the debugging. So to do that, we need to make a compound, and I just went ahead and hit tab to fill out this template, but you can just type it out. The name of it really doesn't matter, it's just going to be what shows up in that drop-down again, but for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just do full debugger. Now what is the configurations? The configurations are these ones down here, so the ones that we made and the one that was made earlier by VS Code. And we want both of those. So my preference is I just like to do it in the order that I care about them. So the .NET Core launch, and we need to do our new debugging browser one. And if you save your changes there, you now have a full debugger one. I don't know why I put debugger. There we go. With the configuration that's going to launch both of these every time it starts. Now we also want to stop them both every time one of them stops. So to do that, we need to add one more flag here, and we're going to set the stop all to true. So if the browser debugger stops, it's going to stop the .NET Core launch one, and vice versa. And if we were to look in our list again, now we have a section here called full debugger. And just to kind of demonstrate that the debugger is actually going to let us do breakpoints, I'm going to go into the client app folder. There's no reason for you to do this step. I just want you to see what is actually available now. And I will go to the counter page. I'll open up the counter.component.ts. And you can see that there's a function here called increment counter. And there's a button on the web page that every time it's clicked, it's going to run this piece of code here. So if we were to set a breakpoint here, now I like to click on the side here, but the F9 key, depending on what line you're on, will toggle a breakpoint off and on. So we've got a breakpoint set, so anytime this counter button is clicked, we're going to go ahead and get VS Code to stop the execution of that code, and we'll pause it and wait for us to kind of analyze or look at whatever we need to. So I'm going to hit F5 to start debugging. And you should see a browser window pop up. Oh, I've got two browser windows popping up, and that's not going to work for us. The problem is that we let the old task, I'm going to just go ahead and stop what I'm doing. I'll go back to the launch.json. And if you look down here in the old task, that there's still this code here that wants to launch a web browser for just this task. We're going to go ahead and comment that out. So just the server ready action down to the line under pattern should be commented out. Now I did Control// on my keyboard, but you can just type these 2 // before each line to make sure that they're all gone. So I'll save those, and we still have our breakpoint there. So let me go ahead and launch this now. Oh, and let me actually let you see the web browser. So you can see it's launching the SPA proxy, and I've also got that command prompt or terminal window that's open. And I'm just waiting for it to detect that it's compiled. All right, so the website came up. Now if we go to the counter page and we click the increment button and we go back to Visual Studio Code, you can see that it actually did break at the correct breakpoint. You can see our variables are over here, and there's really not much to discuss in here for now. So just keep in mind now we have a working debugger for the client code, and I'll also do the same thing over here with some of the .NET code. So under the controllers folder, instead of the client app, now we're up on controllers, there's that weather forecast controller. So this is the .NET API that the website is calling to really just generate some fake weather every time it's called. And if we were to set a breakpoint here under this get method, and we were to go back to the website that I minimized, let me bring it up for you guys. Now if we go over to the Fetch Data tab, as soon as this page is loaded, it's going to call the API. So I'll click Fetch Data, and you can see nothing's coming up on the browser because if we go back to Visual Studio Code, you can see that that breakpoint was hit here now on the server-side code as well. And again, I hit F5 to continue, but you can hit the play button again up here. And that is more or less it for getting the debuggers set up for your project. You now have the debugging enabled for both the client and server-side code, which is going to make it a lot easier for you as we continue down this series. Okay, so let's stop debugging on this. You can see I hit the stop button once and it stopped both of them. I think the next important thing to do, this may not apply in the future, but I like to just go ahead and do a Angular update on this client-side code early on in the project, make sure I'm up to date. In order to do that, we can't have any code pending. You can see we've got the launch.json changes that we made, and me, because I did the peacock colors, you can see I've also got this settings file with some pending changes. So we'll just say added debugger for client side, added task for debugger client side, and I'll just commit those changes. Okay, so in order to do our Angular update, we'll just go ahead and go down to our terminal, or you can open a new command prompt, however you prefer to do this. And we will want to browse into our website folder, and then from the website folder into the client app. Now, an easy way to do this is also just to right-click on the folder that you want to get to, so in this case, client app. And if you hit open in integrated terminal, it will take you to a fresh terminal window with that path already set. So however you prefer to do it. What we want to do is type in a command that's ng, and all of the Angular command lines, they all start with ng, and we'll do ng update. So hit enter, and this will take a couple moments to run, maybe a minute or two depending on your system. So I'll just leave it running so you guys can kind of see the duration and not wonder why yours is taking a lot longer than mine. If I skip ahead, and what it's doing is examining all of the Angular packages, because there's quite a few of them, and just looking for updates. So we've got here the Angular CLI and Angular core projects. They both need updated, and they're going to go from 13.1.2, which is what we're at now, or 1 in this case, to both be 13.3.3. You can see the command update here. we can actually combine those commands into one. So we'll do ng update, and I like to do them in the order that it shows them in. I don't know if that's necessarily required, but and then we'll also do angular/core, and I will hit enter. And the reason why you want to use ng update instead of just using the npm commands to install new packages is because this actually will go ahead and try to detect if there's things that change during those versions in between, and actually make changes to your code to upgrade anything that was affected by it into a working version here. Not sure. Angular extension. Okay, so our Angular extension had a little error during the upgrade. That's no big deal. And we're just going to continue waiting for the updates to run. And just while we're waiting, you can see what it's actually doing is it's updating the package.json for these different Angular packages to the 13.3.3 version. So even though we only typed in 2, there's dependencies for the other ones that it knows need to be upgraded as well. So hopefully you also get packages successfully installed. And if we were to go look inside of our client app folder, and we were to look at our package.json, you'll now see all of these Angular ones are sitting at 13.3.3, and there's a couple down here that are dev ones just for that don't actually get released with your project that we use, and they're also at 13.3.3 now. I won't get into this file yet. In the future videos, I'll explain to you exactly what's happening in this file and what it's used for. And as with everything we're kind of doing like this, whenever we do something and it's successful, so let's test out and make sure that we're actually still running a successful website after that upgrade. And I'll flip you over here to the web browser. There you go. Launching the SPA proxy, still good there. And then hopefully we'll have a compiled successfully message here. This terminal window is definitely where you're going to see if there was some errors during that upgrade that now we have to deal with. But in this scenario, the update worked flawlessly, as I can say that it almost always has done for me, and I've done many Angular websites at this point. So the upgrade process works really well. And now that it's successfully ran, I'll just go ahead and stop debugging, and I'm going to check in my code, and I'm just going to say Angular updated to 13.3.3, and just go ahead and click the checkbox to commit that. The next thing I kind of want to show you is why that terminal window keeps coming up every time we launch our project. So let me just launch this project again. And as soon as the browser loads, I'll go ahead and flip over to that for you guys. Okay, there we go. Now, this terminal window here on the bottom left of your screen, this is the Angular development server. So you've actually got two web servers running at the moment. You've got the .NET backend one, and you've got this Angular Live development server. Now this development server isn't something that actually gets released in production. It's just for this development and debugging process here. The .NET one, depending on what you end up putting this behind, whether you use IIS or some other web server, that .NET one is actually what's going to serve up the Angular files to you at that point. But because none of those have been compiled, and this is all working off temporary files and in-memory stuff, this development server is also part of the process. So you've got two websites running and they have to talk to each other. And there's actually a proxy in between them that we'll go a little bit more in depth on in an upcoming video. But for now, what I wanted to show you was why this is here, what it's doing. And so in order to kind of demonstrate that, you'll see that the very first line here is the website 00 pre-start, and the last line is compiled successfully. But if I go back into Visual Studio and I make a change to one of the client-side files, and I guess we'll just use the counter again as an example, but I'll make a change to the HTML. So you can see that there's a paragraph up here that says this is a simple example of an Angular component. And I will just add something like great. Now when I save that change, you can see down here in the logs that it said app updating and reloading and recompiling here. And if we flip over to the screen where you can see my terminal window, you can see that it actually has some additional lines down here at the bottom now that it ran. So what it did was it updated all of those client-side files to make sure that our change is being incorporated in the website. So there was a quick load of the website that you didn't see, but it takes less than a second depending on the size of your project. And if we go over to the counter now, you can see that this is a simple example of the Angular component. Great. So this is all going to happen fairly fast, and you don't need to stop debugging and start debugging every time you make a change. So that is why this terminal window is popping up every time. And you can just keep it minimized or, put it off to the side if you have another monitor. But it's important that it stays open, and it's important that you don't completely forget about it, because if you make a change, let's just go back into the counter.ts here. And let's just say that this was something invalid. Maybe I typed in the variable name wrong, so I'll type current.cont. Now, the IntelliSense in Visual Studio Code with the extensions that we have involved, it's already telling me that that's not the right thing to do. But I'm going to go ahead and save this change anyway. And you can see already down in the log window here that I got some errors. But if we flip over to the actual terminal window, you'll see that it's going to tell us specifically what went wrong. And it's saying that in the counter.component.ts on line 11, the property current.cont does not exist on the type counter component, which is the component here, the class that we're in. So it even mentions, did I mean current count? So there's a little bit of intelligence to it, and definitely we did mean current count. So I'll flip that back, I'll save it, and if we go back to the terminal window again, you can see now it's successfully compiled, and it's no longer giving us that error. Now it's just going to keep a log of everything going up, so the fact that it was an error. But now, as long as your last message is compiled successfully, you should be in good shape. Now along those same lines, the .NET side of things, so when I say the .NET side of things, I mean things outside of this client app folder for the most part. So anything inside of the client app folder, I'm just going to call it Angular as we move forward, even though technically it's not all Angular related, it's the client stuff. And then on everything outside of that folder, I'm just going to call it the .NET stuff, or maybe I'll call it the backend or server side. But this is all going to be the actual .NET code. So one of the things with the .NET, the way it's set up, is we're not going to get that hot reload functionality. I could walk you through setting it up right now, but when you enable the hot reload functionality, you lose, at least as far as I know, as far as I've been able to get it set up, you lose the actual debugging and breakpoint side of it. So if you make changes outside of the client app folder in our backend side of things, you will have to stop and start the debugger again in order for those to be applied. So if we were to, for instance, change it so the temperature always reads 55. And I save that change, and I still have my last debugging session open. I'll bring up the website for you guys, and I go to fetch data. What's going on? The temperature in Celsius is not being listed as 55. It's still got the old random stuff in there. So we'll go back to VS Code and we'll stop debugging. And we'll start debugging again, F5. Again, wait for your browser to launch. Now on mine, obviously you're looking at a black screen. I'm trying to make that not happen for too long, but you'll get your terminal in your browser once those set up. We'll just validate that when we go to the fetch data. Now you can see it's always being listed as 55 as you'd expect. So just keep in mind that everything inside of the client app folder, you don't have to start and stop it for your changes unless you make changes to some very specific files. And if you have a problem like that, it doesn't hurt to stop and start it once in a while, but 85% of the time while you're in here writing in the client app, you won't need to stop and start the debugger. So that's really handy. And again, you can set up .NET, you can set up a task here for .NET Watch and to do the run, but when you do that, at least as far as I figured out, you don't get the debugging steps anymore. So we're going to leave that off. It's just really helpful to be able to set those breakpoints while you're going through things. All right. Another thing or two I just wanted to mention real quick is let's go ahead and stop debugging if you have anything going. And if you look in your debug console window, you'll see these loaded messages here, and these can really get in the way while you're trying to read some output, that you've logged specifically to the console window. And in order to get to just the meat and potatoes of things, these module load messages, we don't want to see those anymore. So if you go to your launch.json and you go down to the section for the .NET Core launch, and we'll just go to the last section here, but again, it just matters if it's in the right spot or not. We're going to add a new section called logging. We'll add a new key called module load, and we want to set those to false, so those aren't being logged anymore. And just to demonstrate that, we'll launch it, and we'll wait on this debug console to connect up. Now, I'm not seeing anything there anymore. What's going on, you might wonder? Well, there's different sections of the debug console now. So we have the client one that we set up, and we have the server side, the .NET one that we set up. And by default now, it just selected the browser debugger. But if I click this, you'll see again, we have those sections that we've set up. And I'm going to pick the .NET Core Launch one. And you can see now we've got just those blue messages that we expected without all of the extra stuff in the way. And those messages will just, again, they'll really hinder you being able to find the information that you're looking for in this debug console window. Just keep in mind that potentially it might start on the wrong one. It really is just going to depend on some timing and who beats who. But hopefully it's going to stay on .NET Core Launch now that I've selected it. But if you wanted to actually see output messages from the web browser's console, you would come in here, and just to kind of demonstrate that real quick, I don't want to go too much into logging or anything like that yet, but we'll just go through a really simple console.log, and we'll just say, hello, the button was clicked. And we'll save that. And I'm going to flip over to the website again. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to click the increment button. And flipping back to Visual Studio Code for you now, you'll see down here in my console, I have hello, the button was clicked. So you get the messages for the debugger for the browser there, but those aren't going to show up here on the .NET Core side of things. So just keep in mind we have two separate tasks going on. We have two separate kind of projects going on. It's really two separate projects that are just connected by this proxy in the middle of them. And I will go ahead and clean that up. I don't like to really use the console logger in general, but I definitely don't want to leave that test message there. Now I think that more or less is going to wrap up everything for the first video. You've got a working debugger for the client and server, your website's launching, you're committing your code to source control, which we'll go ahead and do now. I want to undo my weather change, so I'm just going to, inside of the source control window, I could come in here and I could undo it manually, but since I know for sure that nothing in here as we scroll down through the changes and see the difference between them, I'm just going to go ahead and hit the undo or discard changes button here, and we'll discard the changes. And I'm showing a confirmation window on my screen. I'm going to click discard changes, and it's going to undo that. Up here, what happened here with the change was the formatter actually put something in on its own. This really doesn't matter too much. I actually don't know why it would put a comma at the end there. That seems less valid than the old way. And it keeps doing it unsafe. So depending on your formatter, it may be doing things like this when you're opening and closing and saving files that you didn't actually make a change, but it's showing up for changes, and that's just because the formatter has done something. And if I figure out, a better formatter that's not adding the extra comma here, which I feel like is invalid, then I'll let you guys know in a future video. Same here with this crate. I could undo it manually, but I'm just going to go ahead and hit the discard changes on it. And we know for sure we wanted to keep the change in the launch.json, which was turning off those module load messages. And just real quick to mention, I think I had not mentioned this before, there's some other options inside of this logging. You can turn off the thread exit messages. Now, those are already turned off by default, but if you feel like some of these messages are showing up and you want to go ahead and exclude them, just know that that's possible. So again, I can't seem to do this while my changes are, so I'm just going to commit it and not worry about it for now. It's still actually, functional working code. So what we'll do is we'll say excluded module load messages from debug. And check that in. Okay, just again, to finish this wrap up here, we've got the two projects, the .NET, well, they're one singular project in this instance, but basically for the sake of keeping it simple, we've got the two projects, the Angular project, the .NET APIs, the backend part of it. We can debug and set breakpoints in both of them. And that's more or less it. Hopefully you learned a couple of things in this video and you'll follow the next ones. Thanks.